Hello and welcome to a special Business Standard interview on climate change. It's clear that we are not on track to meet the Paris target of limiting global warming to ideally 1.5 degrees Celsius. In fact, current policies imply greater than 3 degrees Celsius warming by the end of the century. This will be disastrous, and India will be among the countries most affected. Therefore, concerted and credible action is required by the world at large, including India. However, India is yet to achieve its development goals. With that in mind, can it balance growth and reducing emissions? Montek Singh Ahluwalia, renowned economist and former deputy chairman of the Planning Commission, seeks to answer this and other critical questions in his research study for CSEP on India's possible decarbonization strategy. Let's start off with the most vital question. Can India reduce emissions and still grow? And if it can, what strategy should it adopt?
Well, the short answer to your question is yes. Technology has now developed in a way which makes it possible for us to keep growing and not necessarily increase emissions. How is that possible? I think basically, traditionally, the approach to containing the growth of emissions was to increase the energy efficiency of GDP. In other words, you use less energy to produce the same GDP, which is good and still important. But that was not meant to reduce energy requirement completely. There still would be energy. It's just that your energy use would grow less slowly than your GDP would. What are fossil-based energy sources? So you get the energy you need from growth through electricity. And that, first of all, requires a massive electrification. Whenever you're using fossil fuels, you switch to electricity. And that has to be combined with a switch to green sources of electricity. I mean, mere electrification doesn't reduce emissions, because if the electricity is produced by coal, then the emissions are taking place elsewhere. So the big technological breakthrough now is that renewable energy has become cost competitive with coal. Looking ahead, costs are falling and they're likely to fall further. As a result, you can grow, you can meet an expanding need of energy from electricity, and you can turn to green sources of electricity, so the expanded electricity production doesn't lead to emissions. That's basically the technological possibility that has opened up now.
Understood. So, moving on, what should be India's emissions reduction target? By when should our emissions peak, and by when should they decline to net zero?
We haven't done our own independent research on that, but what we've done is reviewed a lot of research that has been done by others. And I'm very happy to say that there's now quite a lot of quantitative work being done by different people looking at the likely energy needs of India between now and, let's say, 2050 or even further. And I think what many of these models seem to suggest is that we could think of emissions peaking by 2040 and then slowly coming down. Different target dates can be set for the end result. Globally, they're talking about 2050 being net zero. We've seen models that make it possible for India to become net zero by 2070. China has offered to become net zero by 2060. This decision, when do you go to net zero, is something that needs much further analysis using energy models. And in our paper, we have suggested that Niti Aayog, which presides over the energy modeling framework, could look at different energy models and come up with a specific number. But very broadly put, peaking by 2040 or even a little before, and reaching net zero by 2070 or maybe a little before is actually feasible at present. And what is more interesting is that it may be even economically feasible, because it's one thing to say that it's technically possible to generate renewable energy, but it's very, very costly. What is now happening is that renewable energy is becoming cost competitive. So it's actually competitive vis-a-vis coal, and will be even more so in the years ahead. Now, there are problems with building an energy system based on renewable energy, because renewable energy tends to be intermittent, but there are ways of handling that. But essentially, peaking sometime by 2040 or a little before, net zero by 2070 or a little before is now feasible. Long-term targets are kind of nice, they're aspirational, but very few people can get excited about a target like 2050 or 2070. That's why I think we need to focus on shorter term targets, which are more actionable. And there, I feel the move away from coal-based electricity is the most important short-term target that we should concentrate on. I think we've looked at some of the existing work. I feel that we could very easily peak the coal use in electricity well before 2030. And actually, if we can do some early retirement of some of the existing coal-based plants and replace them with renewable energy sources, we could actually reduce dependence on coal-based electricity much faster than would otherwise happen. Now, if we make sure that if we allow all the existing coal-based plants that have been set up and that are currently being constructed to live their entire life, then I think we won't get away from coal-based plants till about 2060. But the fact is that many of these plants could be retired early, and there's an economic logic to retiring them early. And if we can do that, and some being planned and not constructed just shouldn't be constructed at all. And that's a very big decision. But if we can take that decision, then I think we could literally say to the world that we are going to peak the use of coal for electricity maybe by 24, 25, something like that, and then start reducing gradually and perhaps end dependence on coal for electricity maybe sometime by 2050 or even a little earlier.
So, as you said, massive electrification is critical for an emissions reduction strategy. With that in mind, what is the scope for electrification across sectors?
Well, that's a good question, and we've looked at it reasonably carefully. And the news is not bad at all. I mean, first of all, let's look at passenger transport. Passenger vehicles, whether they are cars or two-wheelers or even buses, can actually be electrified without too much difficulty, certainly over the next 2 or 3 decades. You'll have some difficulty in electrifying heavy trucks for freight movement and electrifying heavy moving equipment. For these, we may either have to continue to use fossil fuels, and I'll come to the issue of residual fossil fuel use later, or you could move to hydrogen, which is a promising alternative fuel, and definitely over the next 10, 20 years, this will become possible. All of train travel, train movement, both of freight and passengers can be electrified. It's already heavily electrified. We just have to accelerate that pace of electrification. So trains will not use diesel at all. And this transition could take place in the next 20 years, in my view. Then you have industry. Now, a lot of industry is already electrified. The difficulty is where you have high heat processes, steel making, cement making, aluminum, and so on. There it's not easy to switch from fossil fuels to electricity. So there'll be some residual industrial use, but you could in fact move to hydrogen as a source of heat, and that's something that we need to explore. There'll be residual fossil fuel use in that area. As far as buildings are concerned, it's all electrified anyway, both commercial and domestic. Maybe some use of wood for heating in the colder parts of the country, but this can be changed to electricity, again, over the next 2 decades. Cooking is a problem area in the sense that we are actually at an early stage of the transition, from burning coal on the one hand to gas and kerosene on the other. But that transition can be moved into greater electrification over a period of time. Remember, we are talking about net zero by 2050. So by then, many more households will be urban, household income levels will be higher. It should be possible to switch them to using electricity for cooking also. Agriculture, the use of electricity for solar pumps, that's an area where solar electricity can be used in a very big way. So I think there is quite a lot of scope for electrification. But our overall conclusion is that by 2050, we will not be able to completely eliminate the use of fossil fuels. Some use of fossil fuels will remain. And this will have to be dealt with either by what is called carbon capture and storage. You extract carbon from the atmosphere. You could introduce carbon capture and storage with the remaining coal-based thermal plants so that the carbon aspect of the use of solar of coal is countered effectively. And I mean, there is, of course, the possibility of hydrogen, methanol, which come in and fuel. I mean, for example, airplanes, ship transport, those are not areas where we easily see a replacement of the present kind of fuels. But again, hydrogen can make a big difference in those areas. So the scope is there, but getting to 100% by 2050, I don't think is possible. But you know, we should get from, at present, electricity only accounts for about 20% of our final energy use. We should plan to jack it up to around 80% or something of that order within 20 years. Now that's a very big transition, but it's possible.
Noted, Mr. Ahluwalia. So moving on, how will the shift to electric vehicles impact Indian industry in general and the automotive sector in particular?
Well, you know, I'm very encouraged by the fact that if you look at the newspapers, many of our automotive producers, especially even others, they've been saying, look, we're moving towards electric vehicles. That's very good. But, you know, we have to, if we're simply taking one or two steps in the right direction, I think the time has come also to define how much we will move. Now, others are doing that. I mean, for example, the EU, the European Commission has proposed legislation that no internal combustion engine car can be sold in Europe after 2035. So that's like telling the whole automotive industry that, look, in the next 14 years, you guys have got to become completely electric. The Americans have recently, I think Mr. Biden with a few other automotive manufacturers has said 50% of vehicles will be sale of vehicles will be electric by 2030. Now, you know, you've got to step back a little and say, look, if the objective is to reduce emissions from the entire vehicle fleet, then it's not just important that new vehicles are electric. You have to work out when you're going to change the composition of the whole fleet. And, you know, very roughly, it may, if you have an electric vehicle, I mean, an internal combustion vehicle on the roads, in the United States, maybe it lasts for 10 years or so. In India, it typically lasts for 15 years. So we have to move to 100% of electric vehicle sales about 15 years before we want the whole fleet to be electric so that there are no emissions from automobiles at all. And that is a tough job. I mean, even if you keep out the heavy vehicle stuff and you just look at passenger two-wheelers and so on, I think the present share of EVs is approximately 2%. Now, people are talking cheerfully that we're going to raise this to 25% in 10 years or 15 years. Actually, the question is, can we raise this to 100% for this category of vehicles by, let us say, 2035 or 2030 or 2040? Because if we want to go to net zero by maybe 2065, then new vehicles should only be electric 15 years before that date so that the existing stock can phase out. That signal should go to Indian manufacturers early enough. I think our manufacturers will have their own problems. They will say there are structural difficulties. But, you know, that's a long enough time period for them to adjust. But we need to give a clear signal. Now, I feel that that signal should be further intensified. For example, by the central government could say that for all replacement of existing central government vehicles, or for any hiring of vehicles for the purpose of the central government, let's say from 2023 onwards, giving a little year or so more, 2 years more, all of this will have to be electric. So our producers will have a signal that there's going to be a central government demand for electric vehicles. Now, these vehicles may not be as large as some of our VIPs want, but they can be reasonably comfortable. And I think we should give that clear signal and say that's what the central government is going to do. And the central government should also incentivize state governments to do the same thing. We already have a scheme for incentivizing the use of commercial buses which are electric. We should massively upgrade that with a clear target that 100% of the replacement of commercial buses for public transport in all state governments should be electric. And I think this is a fitting area and giving a kickstart to something which needs to be done. So I think we should do that. I think there are other things we have to take into account. If you switch to electric vehicles, then compared to an internal combustion engine, an electric engine has far fewer components. This will, in the longer term, lead to a phasing out of a lot of component manufacturers if that technology is totally phased out. But if they have enough advance notice, they can diversify into other areas. On the other hand, the demand for batteries will increase hugely. And I think we need to put in place a clear plan that invites people to set up high quality battery production, which is technologically competitive. It's not enough to say that we must be self-sufficient and then get locked into a technology that is outdated, because battery technology is going to change rapidly. But I think it makes a lot of sense to bring in some battery producers, tell them that, look, you're going to get some initial incentive, whatever they are, we should think about that. But you have to compete with imported batteries at a reasonable level of protection. We should certainly avoid a situation where people set up low quality battery with locked in technologies which are outdated and then seek protection in order to keep going. Thus, locking us into battery technology that has become outdated 10 years from now. That's a really big area. EVs can only work if there's a charging infrastructure. And that raises a lot of issues. I mean, for example, if the home vehicles are going to be charged at home, or quite possibly in the office, we're not going to need so many petrol stations in the city because they're not going to be used. I'm talking about the next 30 years. I'm not talking about now. I think our oil producing companies need to think about what are they going to do with all these innumerable petrol stations. Are they going to be changed into charging stations? Some of them could be. Maybe we need to go into a battery swapping mode. Now, that's a very interesting development where a very large part of the cost of an electric car is the battery. But you don't have to own the battery. I mean, you could have a system where you effectively hire the battery. I mean, just as when you buy a car with a petrol tank, you don't pay for all the petrol that's going to be used in the life of the car. So there's no reason why you can't have a system where you pay for the battery that you're going to use for the next, whatever, 100, 200 kilometers. And then you swap that with a charge of some kind for a charged battery. Now, the automotive companies and the petroleum companies can collaborate to work out such a system of charging. These are experimental forms which need to be started now so that by the time the change comes, people feel reassured. It's very important to do that if EV is to be anything more than just a sort of icing on the cake.
So, phasing out coal and oil will present some problems of structural change. Can you comment on that?
Yes, they're going to be very important. And again, in our paper, we've emphasized them, not, by the way, to say that we shouldn't do that, but rather to say that if we are to be realistic, we must make all the players aware that this is how things are going to happen. Now, look, if we are going to phase out the use of coal by 20, 40, 50, something like that, then it must be very clear that coal production is not going to increase. On the other hand, if we're going to increase renewables, and that increase will be massive, because at the moment electricity accounts for about 20% of our final energy use, and maybe renewables account for 10% of that. Now, if our electricity becomes 80% of our final energy use, and if renewables become 80% of that, then the growth in renewables is going to be huge. And so a lot of employment is going to be created in the MNRE sector in exchange for a reduction in employment in the coal and also the petroleum sector. That's one consequence. Second consequence is that, state revenues. I mean, royalties from coal are at the moment an important source of revenue for the states that produce coal. They will go down. We have to factor in that these are poorer states. So some compensating transfer from the central kitty will be necessary, and maybe every 5 years, the finance commission will have to take that into account. When it comes to petroleum, both the center and the state get a huge amount of revenue from petroleum. Now, if petroleum is also going to phase down, we need other sources of revenue from the center, and we need to think about how that's to be done. One simple thing would be that if we are not using coal and we're not using petroleum, and I'm now talking about a three-decade horizon, I just think we have to raise the rate of indirect taxes to compensate for the loss of petroleum duty. But how this is to be done, in what manner, how it is to be phased in, this requires a lot of hard work. It should be put on the agenda of what I would call longer-term tax reform. I think there are other transitional problems. For example, if you're going to have this massive increase in renewables, a lot of which is going to be solar, then the land requirement is going to be massive also. I don't think you can expect private investors to be able to acquire that degree of land on their own. Now, most of this land will be acquired in areas which have very low agricultural productivity. Desert areas out in Gujarat, maybe in Rajasthan and Gujarat are the two obvious ones. I think the state governments have to play a very active role in making land available and looking after the interests of those who are drawing some sustenance from this land. So advanced thinking on how that is to be done so that we can actually say to potential solar producers that, look, there's all this land available. You can bid for solar power generation and simultaneously build capacity for creating power. Now, when you again look at renewables, they're intermittent. I mean, there's a peak period during the day, then it tails off. In the case of solar, obviously, once the sun goes down, there's no solar generation. The wind, fortunately, comes a little bit in the evening. But for any kind of grid management, you need a relatively even supply of electricity, at least a supply that's matched with demand. And demand has its own peaks. So how do you do that? It requires a very complex set of balancing. For example, you can optimize solar and wind together. Because their peaks are different. So a combined solar and wind source would provide some evening. You can use battery storage to store excess electricity during solar peak hours and then use it when you need it, when the solar generation is lower. This will increase the cost of solar generation. I mean, a lot of what you hear about falling solar costs are not based on a balancing requirement to even out the supply. Technically, it's possible, but if you do that, then the cost goes up, and you have to work out whether solar is still competitive at that higher price. My judgment is that it will be still competitive, especially if you put in a carbon tax. Because around the world, there's a lot of talk now about carbon taxes. Logically, since use of coal is polluting, it generates externalities, it makes a lot of sense to put a carbon tax on coal during the transition so that coal-based electricity becomes more expensive. The tax can then be used to fund a lot of things. It can be used to fund the adjustment of the coal-bearing states to the loss of coal royalties in future. It can be used to fund the provision of balancing equipment that would even out the supply of power. And combined with that, you have to move towards much more sophisticated time of day metering. I mean, shifting demand as much as possible to correspond with peaks in the supply. Now, we do have time of day metering at present, but it's very crude and it's not tailored to achieve balance. So, frankly, all of this will require a really massive upgrading of the management capacity of our regulatory system, including the load dispatch system, the regional load dispatches, etc., because you're going to be handling variable and intermittent supplies with demand on the other hand, which is also variable but is much more steady. So I think we have to do a lot of work in that. And I don't think our present system by itself can do it, but we have a lot of time. Making the system more effective will be a very important objective. And underlying all of this, quite honestly, is the financial viability of the discoms. There is no way the estimate of funding required for the new energy infrastructure is huge. I mean, we roughly estimated that about 1.8% of GDP per year is what needs to be invested in the energy infrastructure between now and 2050 if we are to bring about this transition. Okay. Now, this 1.8% cannot possibly be met by either the central government or the state government. It has to come from the private sector, simply because both the center and the states have huge demand on their resources owing to other needs. There are other infrastructure demands. There are what you might call support for agriculture, support for defense, support for health, support for education, etc., etc. Now, energy is one of those things which is really absorbed by a growing economy, and a growing economy must be willing to pay a price for that energy. And for that, the present system where state governments intervene in a very irrational way to make tariffs uneconomic and make the discoms vulnerable and unviable is totally unsustainable. It's unsustainable because this is a system that can only be sustained if public investment is going on in generation, which doesn't actually care whether it gets the money or not. If we're going to rely on the private sector, we can only attract this investment needed if the buyer of the electricity is seen to be financially viable. And at the moment, I'm afraid the buyers are not seen to be financially viable. So this huge increase that we want in electrification is not going to happen unless the financial position of the state electricity boards is greatly strengthened. And this is not, in my view, just a matter of a little adjustment here and a little adjustment there through one of these rehabilitation schemes. I myself was involved earlier in 2 or 3 SEB, DISCOM, rehabilitation, restructuring schemes. They all failed. They, in the end, did not bring about the change needed. We are currently experimenting with that. I hope it's more successful. But I think if we simply stick with the present system and hope that through marginal adjustments we will achieve the results, I don't think we'll get them. And I think one of the big things we need to do, in my view, is to introduce much more private discoms in the system, just to demonstrate that it's possible through better management to produce better results. I mean, that's already happening because the privately managed discoms are producing better results than many of the public discoms, which are not. So I think that's a big challenge. It looks as if we are just talking about climate change, but actually talking about climate change is talking about reworking the energy system. So essentially, it boils down to all the changes needed to make energy system financially viable.
Taking all your points together, what strategy would you suggest for India in COP26?
Yeah, I think that this is going to be a very important issue because it's going to come up in the G20 meeting in October in Italy. It'll come up again in the COP26 in Glasgow in November. Traditionally, we have tended to take the view that we cannot reduce emissions because our energy per capita is very low. We're a developing country, we have a lot of development to do. This is no longer, in my view, a credible argument because people will just say that, of course, you need to grow and, of course, you need energy. But there is renewable energy, and you have a lot of solar capacity, and basically just switch to renewable energy and do it quickly. I think it's time for us to also now say that, all right, we are willing to lay out a trajectory for emissions reduction and also a trajectory for getting out of coal-based electricity. Now, in our paper, we have said that this should not be thrust upon us by some diplomatic maneuvering and negotiations. We should have an internal national process of determining what is feasible. We already have an energy modeling forum, which is presided over by the Niti Aayog, which looks at all the different energy models that exist. And some of them have different views because, after all, this is a technical issue, and on different assumptions, you can get different results. So our recommendation is that we should task the Niti Aayog to look at all these models and come up and consult with relevant stakeholders, industry groups, etc., and come up with a reasonable picture. You have to keep in mind that many of our corporates are already saying that they want to go net zero by 2050. I think Reliance has said so, Adani has said so, the Tatas have said so, several others. I don't want to list them all. So the corporates are responding to what is a current global picture. And I think that we should say, well, look, we thought about it too, and this is our proposal. I mentioned earlier that in my view, peaking maybe a little before 2040 and net zero 2070 or a little before is quite feasible. We could do better if the results of the Niti Aayog study show it. And I think we should consult with industry and generate the consensus needed to bring about this change. The move from coal-based electricity is even more important because that needs to be done in the next 10 years, not by 2050, or at least the process needs to be started. And I think we should give a very clear signal there that we are going to start reducing the use of coal for the generation of electricity very soon, and then give some indication. I mean, if we can't give an indication of when it'll go to zero, we could at least say that by 2040, coal use in electricity will be reduced to X% of what it was at the peak point, whatever that X% is. I think a strategy of this kind will put India in the forefront of being serious about climate change. And let me say that India is going to be the chair of the G20 in 2023 or something like, I think it's 2023. By then we should have moved quite far ahead in being able to define what our climate targets are. And I think to the public at large, we have to also explain that we are one of the worst sufferers from climate change. This is not just an academic exercise. I mean, if global warming continues, the monsoon is likely to be very different from what we are used to. The flow of water from our glaciers is going to be quite different. And we face massive change, which we have to adjust, we have to start getting used to do.
So, what would be the key pillars on which India's decarbonization strategy could build on?
Well, I think the key pillars would clearly be, number one, a massive electrification strategy. And then you lay out if you like, a roadmap of all the things you have to do to get that done. A massive strategy of shifting away from fossil fuel-based electricity to green energy, and you lay out a roadmap of what needs to be done. And when I say roadmap, it takes into account some of the institutional changes that are needed. And I think for example, the regulatory system, making it more sophisticated, time of day metering, etc. These things are actually being talked about. What I'm saying is not something very different, but they're not all being pulled together when we sort of look at the overall objective of looking credible on climate change. They're all being discussed in little silos somewhere or the other. I think it needs to be pulled together. And I think that in addition to that, we need to be very clear on what is the investment needed for India to make this transition as a percent of GDP. Maybe some of it will come from international multilateral development banks. Most of it will have to come from the private sector, both foreign and domestic. And I think we should be very clear that this is the scale of investment that we need. I think this is one of the key issues which people are often not clear about, because many people find that, oh, it's difficult to get the private sector, so let's get the public sector to do it. Let's be clear about it. The public sector doesn't have the money. And therefore, either we are going to get electricity or we're going to run into serious shortages. The idea that we're going to offset this by government investment is just wrong, because government has to do a lot in other areas. And energy is an area which a well-functioning economy should be willing to pay for. Let me say that the energy needs of the poor are very small, and they can always be met by the government. Nothing wrong with subsidizing the poorest households for a basic amount of electricity. I would actually favor not mucking up the tariff, but giving a direct benefit transfer to the household. And nowadays, direct benefit transfer can be used for a specific purpose. So you're not even giving a direct benefit transfer, they can use for something else. Give every person, maybe the bottom 20 or the bottom 30% of the population, a subsidy transfer which would make the core minimum requirement of electricity affordable.
Let's come to the core question. So, where is the money? What are the implications of all these things for climate finance?
Well, look, I think on climate finance is very clear. The global estimate is that the developing countries need $600 billion per year. It's also estimated that India's share of this might well be $150 billion per year. What the global community has said was that they will provide $100 billion of a combination of private and public and bilateral finance for all developing countries. What India's share would be in this was never very clear, but is unlikely to be more than, let's say, 10%. So the fact is that the global commitment at the moment is hopelessly inadequate. We should certainly make the point that if the global community is serious about pushing and encouraging countries to take on action, $100 billion per year, which hasn't, by the way, been delivered. I mean, the actual delivery is much below. It should be raised. How much it should be raised is something to be debated, but it could easily, over a 10, 20-year period, they should raise it to something like 250 or $300 billion. If we can get that done, that's good. But you know, that this $300 billion, they will still say is public and private. So the negotiation really is about MDBs, multilateral development banks, World Bank, ADB. I think we should certainly say that these institutions have a very important role to play in helping us with the transition. Their capital needs to be substantially increased in order to enable them to play this role. And more important, you know, the single country limit, which prevents them from lending more than, I forget, 10% or something to each individual country, is actually quite unreasonable. I mean, it operates against the interests of large countries. So I think we should get rid of, and especially if the World Bank and the IMF, and it's not the IMF, the World Bank and the ADB, if they're working jointly with the private sector, I think for green energy, it should be completely outside any single country limit. Any country that's able to provide an environment that's attractive for private investment, in which these MDBs also want to participate, and that can help. because their involvement encourages private sector entrepreneurs. They think they get a fairer deal, etc. That should be outside the country limit. That's a very, very important change that should be made. And that's something we could negotiate, I guess, or put forward both in the G20 in October and later on in the COP26 in November.
Last but not least, is India currently on the right path to achieving lower emissions?
Well, I think, look, we've taken the steps. We've taken a hard stand on increasing solar capacity. At the moment, we're not achieving that, but that's a different matter. So the fact that we have put solar capacity high on the agenda is a good step. We have talked about the importance of improving discoms. Again, how much we're able to do is an open question. We have not actually been very clear about the willingness to scale down the use of coal. That's something that we should be doing. And that's why I think, if you just look at a ministry and ask them, what is your coal production target for 2050, there'll generally be an increase. This is one area where we are planning for a structural shift, which means that really the coal ministry should be saying, we are planning to phase down production over a certain period. And I don't think we are there yet. NTPC, for example, they're already doing that. But the NTPC, the National Power Corporation, you should rename itself the National Power Corporation, in which thermal, i.e. coal-based power, will be just one part of its portfolio. And it should take on a much larger role in generating solar power. So I think we are facing in the right directions. We have taken some steps, but I don't think the steps are commensurate with the scale of what needs to be done. I mean, you can always be in a situation where you take a few steps, but the real challenge is, have we taken and defined the steps needed to respond to the scale of the challenge? And I think we haven't yet done that. The fact that we have taken these steps means that we should be willing to expand them. And that's really my purpose in doing this presentation in the Center for Social and Economic Progress, was to put these things out in the public domain. And there are other institutions that are doing the same thing. The Council for Energy, Environment and Water is doing a lot of good work. Other organizations are doing good work. We should let this be more widely known, let the implications be more widely discussed. Europe has floods. California has forest fires because of high heat. We have problems, and you're seeing them all. China has floods. So it's no longer some academic thing which is going to happen in the long term. The problem is that, when you have floods, people don't immediately ask the question, and how's our solar energy program going? The whole idea is how do we bring relief to those who are hit, which is right. That's the most immediate thing. But underneath all this has to be a longer term strategy that will cope with the underlying causes of the change. And that's really what we should do.
Thank you for your time, Mr. Ahluwalia. Hopefully, it's not too late for India and the world to mitigate the most extreme effects of climate change.
If you like this video, share it and subscribe to Business Standard. For more news, views and insights, log on to www.business-standard.com. Do also follow us on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Telegram and LinkedIn.